Yeah, great to be with you guys. Thank you so much, Brian, for inviting me to come join you guys on your journeys. Yeah, it's great. I'd love to. It would be great to meet you guys someday, one day in person. But with our present world, we just have to make do with technology. Thank God for technology. But yeah, thank you, Brian. I remember that incident at the airport quite clearly, um, and it was great to get to know you guys from Horsham. Um, as Brian said, I oversee with now 8 different ARC churches. That's across London, Birmingham, Essex, and now Ireland, and soon to be Uganda as well. So um, yeah, and it's been quite a journey. It's been a tough year, and God's grace has been abundant. I got saved about 34 years ago. God used wonderfully a prison chaplain called David Hughes to minister to me while I was in prison for 2.5 years. And I've been trying recently to reach out and find this guy, David, because God used him so powerfully, instrumentally to lead me to Christ and introduce faith to me. Watching Crossing the Switchblade, Nicky Cruz. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but God used that video powerfully to kind of really get the gospel to me and His power to change my life. And so yeah, when I watched that, had an experience, gave my life to God, said, God, if you get me out of here, I promise you I will go to church and I will serve you. Which I'm sure he's heard that story many times, that prayer. And I eventually did, came out. But I just couldn't find a church. I was 18 at the time, and I just couldn't find a church that I could fit in. I went to a few churches in the area, went to my mum's church, went to a few Baptist churches in the area, but just couldn't feel or sense. I don't know what I was looking for in them days. I know now it'd be the presence of God, but I just couldn't sense it. And, that's why I'm really passionate about the local church, that we just don't know who's coming in. And so when I was trying to find a church and just couldn't find that, what I was looking for, I just ended up drifting back into my old ways, going back onto the streets. And then eventually, like a few months, I ended up at a party and these boys pushed me, ended up in a little situation. I managed to walk away, but about 5 minutes after this happened, they did the same thing to my best friend, Michael, who was 18 at the time. He responded and they stabbed him in his heart 8 times and he died in my arms that night. And it's the first time I watched someone die. And I knew at that stage I needed to go somewhere and really find Christ. And a little old lady introduced me to a church in Bethnal Green where I got saved, properly devoted, committed my life. Let me say, I got saved in prison, but I got converted and changed and transformation at this particular church because God put a pastor, a spiritual father in my life, which is what I really want to talk about today. His name is Harry McFarland. He passed away last year during the pandemic, not of COVID, but he just passed. But yeah, God used him powerfully. So that's kind of like what I want to talk about today. And I'd like to introduce by reading a scripture, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 14 to 15. It says, I write not these things to shame you, but as my beloved sons, I warn you. For though you have 10,000 instructors in Christ, yet have you not many fathers. For in Christ Jesus I have begotten you, became your father through the gospel. So here's Paul saying to the Corinthian church, like, I'm writing these letters. I'm not writing these letters to embarrass you. I'm not writing these letters to shame any of you. I'm not writing these letters to show you up. And I'm not even writing these letters to puff myself up. but because I see you as sons, because I see you as someone that's very dear to me, I just feel like I have to say what I have to say. I'm writing these things to warn you because I can see the dangers ahead if you carry on your line of behavior or beliefs. So I'm writing these things. So he says you can have 10,000 instructors, like teachers. I mean, particularly today when we've got internet, people are listening to all types of teachers and preachers, and they've got exposure to so much today through online. But he says, with all of that, with all the teachers, you don't have many fathers. In other words, what I'm doing in terms of writing on these things to warn you, you ain't got much of that. You've got lots of people that will teach you to different principles, but not many people that care about you enough to warn you. Not many people that care about you enough to correct you, or not many people that care about your well-being enough to instruct you. He says, I became a father when I begot you through the gospel. So, yeah, as I said, this gentleman, Harry McFarlane, when I came into this church in Bethnal Green, he became like a spiritual father. And that actually is what I needed. Few years after, that was 1987, 1992, I ended up for 5 years as a missionary in the island of St. Lucia. What a wonderful place to go as a missionary. And planted a couple of churches over there for 5 years. But whilst I was there, I was reflecting back on my life, and I was asking myself the question, like, how did I end up just in that place in my teens? Like, what happened? How did I end up in prison twice? And how did I end up being stabbed and shot after? How did I end up in all of that kind of lifestyle? And I was asking these questions in my head. And then one night, by accident, I think a film came on the TV, and the film was called Fathers and Sons. And it was about Louis Gossett Jr. and Blair Underwood was in this film. And the film was about this guy, Louis Gossett Jr. had this son, Blair Underwood, but Louis Gossett Jr. was constantly in prison, so he was never there to raise his son. So his son got raised by the streets, and he just looked up. This boy looked up to the guys on the streets, and they became like his mentors, and they become like the guys that he looked up to. And then the son ended up in prison, and it just so happened he got locked up with his father in prison. So they decided to release them both together on parole, with the conditions that if any of them broke the parole, they had to live together. And if any of them broke the parole, they would both end up in prison back together. So it was an interesting thing where they had to live together for the first time. And it happened that the son hated his father because he was never there for him in his life. And it's a journey of this tension between a father and a son, and a son and a father. And they fought many times, they argued many times. And what you could see in the film is that the son also had a daughter, but he wasn't in her life. And so Louis Gossett Jr., the father, was trying to say, well, look, you're hating me for not being present for you, but now you're repeating the very same thing, and you're not there being present for your daughter. So it was just like this cycle. I sort of like to share that God used that video to kind of show me kind of the answer my questions as to what happened to me. Because although I grew up with my father, he wasn't present in my life. And so I began to look to older boys on the road as like father figures. And they influenced me in the wrong way to do the wrong things. And instead of like having a father that would warn me, don't go down that road, I had these boys that was encouraging wrong behaviors and encouraging, like just affirming me in areas that were not good. You know, you're a good fighter, Peter. You are a good thief. All of the things that were negative, I was being affirmed in. And you know, when you get affirmed in the negative things, you want to do more of those things because that's where you're getting your affirmation from. So I learned that stage of my life the importance of fathering and fathers, and it reflected back on God reflected back on at 18 when he gave me that pastor, Harry McFarland, how he fathered me and how he discipled me and how he came into my life intentionally. He wasn't just a man that was in a pulpit on a Sunday preaching words to me, but he was in my life, um, encouraging me to study, encouraging me. He's the one that married me. He's the one, as soon as I thought I found someone that I wanted to settle with, he's the one I went to and spoke to. And he spoke into different areas of my life. So I really want to today encourage you guys about the importance of fathers and sons, because every one of us in here today are sons. We're all sons, have been sons, and maybe I think most of us are fathers or can be also fathers, potential fathers, and also in terms of spiritually, we are all sons, and spiritually, we can all be fathers. So that's what I want to encourage us in. In 1 John 2, verse 14, it says, I write unto you, dear children, because you know the Father. I write unto you, fathers, because you know him that's from the beginning. It says, and I write unto you, young men, because you are strong, and the word of God lives in you, and you have overcome the evil one. Let me read this from the Amplified, 1 John 2:14. He says, I'm writing unto you, fathers, those believers who are spiritually mature, because you know him who has existed from the beginning. I'm writing unto you, young men, those believers who are growing into spiritual maturity, because you've been victorious and overcome the evil one. I've written unto you, children, those new believers, those spiritually immature, because you have come to know the Father. So Paul here, the writer John here kind of looks at believers as children, young men, and as fathers. The children being spiritually immature, the young men being those who are maturing in faith, and then the spiritually mature, the fathers. I feel that's the progression that we all should be growing in. In the church is interesting because if we're going to have a church that's growing and thriving, then it will mean that every man needs to take on a role of being a son and also being a father, like someone fathering you and also you fathering somebody. I feel like we're in a generation that's like a fatherless, lost generation. And I think, if men don't feel value in terms of church, I feel the one place that we can all fulfill a powerful role is to become strong fathers and intentional fathers. That when young men, if God so was to bring a young man, or if there are young men presently in the congregation, that we intentionally like just become fathers to them, or no matter what age you are, finding someone that's more spiritually mature that you say, I'd like to become a son and to learn from. I'm going to talk about Paul and Timothy in a minute and that relationship. But I remember some years ago, I went on a men's camp. We organized a men's camp. It was about 1 a.m, 2 a.m. We had a fire going. And we were talking. And I put out a question. And the question was like, when did you become a man? And it was interesting, all the different answers that came back. Like someone said, when I had my first child. Someone says, oh, when I got my first job. Someone said, when I moved out of my parents' home, I became a man. Others said, you know, like there was a time when their father was there and he left the mum, left the family, and they had to step up and they became a man. Some of them very early. It was all different. It was interesting because some of them said, "No, I think you become a man when you leave your parents' home." And then there was a guy there who's still at his mom's home, and he's like, "So what are you trying to say? I'm not a man," you know. But it was interesting. There was a guy there from Uganda, and there was a guy there from Nigeria, and it was really interesting that they were the only ones that actually said, like, they became a man when their father told them, "You are now a man, son." And you know, in the Jewish community, they have the bar mitzvah, um, where literally there is a process of coming into manhood. You know, there's a ceremony of celebrating now you're a man. I'm thinking, I don't know how you see this. In our society, how do people know when they become a man? Like, how do you know? When did you become a man? Who did someone tell you? I don't know if we could take a couple of minutes here and you just share for a few seconds and tell me, when did you become a man and how do you know when you, if you could just pause yourself, sorry, unmute yourself and just tell me very briefly for time's sake, like, when did you become a man and how did you know that you were a man? Is that okay? Someone, anyone? No takers.
I, I'll have a shot at it, Peter.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd have been similar to some of the guys that were there on that evening. I left home at 18 to join the RAF, and I, yeah, I mean, I'm very fortunate. My father's passed away now, but I had a really father who was very present in my life. And but I can remember him leaving me at the gates of this camp to start my square bashing, and actually being quite, you know, worried. What have I done? And years after, my mum told me how my dad had cried on the way home in the car, and I'd never seen my dad cry. Wow. But I think that was probably the time when my dad, he didn't say it, but was probably saying, "Now you're a man, son. Now you're a man."
Thank you very much for sharing. Yeah. Two more people, one or two more, please.
I think with me, my mum and dad never actually said anything, I think, about it. Although I lived in Scotland with them, and I went to university in London. And I guess that was when really life at home stopped, if you like, because I went off to university in London and I never again lived in Scotland, apart from maybe going home for the holidays. And being so far away, I suddenly found myself having to
grow up
everything for myself. Yeah. So that was probably, for me, would have been the point, but I don't think my parents ever said anything like that to me. The one thing I remember is I decided I wanted to get confirmed, and I found I'd never been baptized. So I had to get baptized as an adult in the Anglican Church in order to get confirmed. And my mum and dad gave me a book of common prayer, and my mum wrote in it, "To thy own self be true," because they weren't pursuing any sort of faith at that stage in their life. So I guess that was also a recognition that I was making a choice in direction for myself.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian. One more? Anyone?
Yeah, I agree with Brian that at the age of 18, when you leave for university, it's a sort of one step to freedom. It wasn't so much freedom for me because, I wasn't becoming a man simply because my brother was at the same university. So there was still still a family connection and someone to fall back to. But no, my real step into manhood came when I was 25, and I left to work in Iran, which was my mother said, "Why do you want to do that?" I've never looked at home as where I was brought up as being my home since then. When I came back from university, I bought my own house.
Thank you very much for sharing. Is there Neil one more?
I don't know if it's necessarily when I felt as though I was a man for the first time, but I remember on my 21st birthday, my dad handing me a paddle and an oar and saying, "Now you're 21, son, it's time to paddle your own boat." I think that was something that his father had given him, that he was then passing down the generations, and sort of, "You're on your own now, son," really. Not that he's necessarily left me on my own, but I remember it being a symbolic act. It was quite touching.
Do you have a son, Neil?
Yes.
You're going to take him out and give him a paddle?
Well, I'm just trying to think whether I've still got it, actually. I don't know where it is. I think I would have kept it.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, it's just really interesting that there are cultures where there is a deliberate, intentional process or rite of passage, as they call it, of bringing people and identifying. Paul said in Corinthians, he says, "When I was a child, I spake as a child, I thought as a child, I understood as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things." So there was a time in Paul's life. I'd be interested to ask Paul this question. Like, Paul, when was that time that you became a man? But really, the what I want is not actually when we become. I really want to talk to us about us being intentional about being spiritual fathers, whether that's in the church, the congregation, which I think is so needed and such a powerful role that men can play in a congregation, but also maybe in the community. I remember when I was running around wild as a teenager, there was a man who lived opposite me. It was a taxi driver, I'll never forget. But whenever I saw this gentleman, I just always pulled myself up. I made sure I behaved myself, because he would always pull me up and he would always speak to me and he would always warn me. And he was almost like a statesman, like someone that, I respected and feared, and who kind of spoke to me. And I just feel like we need that kind of relationships to be built within our churches. Let me read a few scriptures. 2 Timothy 3 verse 10. He says, "You, however, know all about my teaching." This is Paul talking to Timothy. "You know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, my faith, my patience, my love, and my endurance." In the NLT, it says, "But you, Timothy, certainly know what I teach and how I live and what my purpose in life is. You know my faith, you know my patience, you know my love, and you know my endurance." Now, this is Paul talking to a gentleman, Timothy, that was half of his age, that was not his biological son, but he was saying to this boy, to this guy, you have complete revelation and insight. I mean, we've spent and done life together, and you've seen my life. Like, you see how I live. You know what my beliefs are. You know what my purpose, what's driving me, my motivations in life. You see my patience. You see how I've handled situations, and you've seen how I've had to love when it was tough, and you've seen how I've had to endure certain situations and get through life, which means that Paul would have been very intentional about allowing Timothy to see into his life. I want to encourage and ask us, like, have we got people around us that's not our biological son, that see into our life, that see our beliefs, our way of life, and our purpose and our faith? Are we being intentional about discipleship and about fathering the next generation and fathering young men and helping them. You know, Jesus, as John says, I write unto you children, I write unto you young men, I write unto you fathers. The fathers should be looking at the generation behind them and saying, well, how do I help you to get here? How do I help you to mature? How do I reach down to the children? You know, if a young person is in the congregation, how do I help them to come into faith? How do I expose them to my life, what I believe and what I teach and my purpose? How do I help them to see my faith and know my patience? You see, the best kind of Christianity is not only taught, but it's also caught. You know, I think sometimes we think that people are transformed just by what we preach from the pulpit or what they hear in a sermon. But I actually feel like people catch more. They catch things. They see behavior. They see faith demonstrated, and they see patience demonstrated. But we've got to expose. But that's not going to happen alone on a Sunday morning for an hour and a half, and then at the end we have a few conversations, cups of coffee, and we go home. Actually, church has got to be broader than that, and we've got to get into the life of the young men and the young ladies that are around in the I know things are a bit difficult today with that, you know, but we've got to get into the lives of these young ones. So let's just look at this real quick. Timothy caught Paul's doctrine. He understood the reason why Paul lived the way that he lived was because of his beliefs. So notice he says, you know my doctrine and the way I live, my way of life. What you believe determines how you live. So not only did, so somehow Timothy would have made a connection between Paul's faith and Paul's behavior, Paul's beliefs and Paul's behavior, which means he didn't see hypocrisy. One of the things my wife said that has made her, she's been in church all of her life, my wife, she's completely different from me, you know. She says the reason why she's been in church from child right through her life is because what her mum was in church is what her mum was at home. Her dad wasn't present in her life, but she didn't see any discrepancy between her mum's faith and her mum's life living. And she said that's what made her stay around. Timothy not only caught Paul's doctrine, but the Bible says, you know my manner of life. That means Timothy was around him enough to learn and to follow. You know, one of the things about discipleship, Jesus talks about the disciples not being above his master. And there is something in discipleship where the rabbis used to teach, but the disciples used to watch their rabbis, and they would want to mimic their behavior and mimic what they do, and just how they lived. Timothy caught Paul's purpose. He recognized that Paul had a purpose in life that allowed him not to be distracted, that gave him direction, that Paul was going somewhere, that his life wasn't just an accidental stuff, that there was a definite focus and purpose about Paul's life. And Timothy was able to catch that. And also he was able to catch Paul's faith, his trust in God, his long suffering and his love. And it was something that inspired Timothy to be like Paul, to the point where Paul said in the book of Philippians, I think it's chapter 2, in verse 19, he says, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, that I also might be cheered when I receive back, for I have no one else like-minded who will show genuine concern for your welfare. For everyone looks after their own interests, but not those of Jesus Christ. But you know that Timothy has proved himself, because as a son with his father, he has served me in the work of the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him to you soon, that I may know how things are going with me. And I am confident in the Lord that I myself will come. He says, I'm going to send Timothy, but I know when Timothy comes, he's going to represent me to the full because he has spent time with me. And he says, I don't have many like-minded, like Timothy, that's going to really care for you the way that I would care for you. That's going to really father you the way that I have. So ask yourself the question, do I have a Timothy in my life? Or do I have a Paul in my life? Is there someone that I am looking up to as a father and being inspired by their faith, being inspired by their doctrine, being inspired by their way of life, by their purpose, by their motives? And I'm really looking into this person and studying their life and feeling, yeah, I want to be like that. Paul commends Timothy in that Philippians chapter 2 for his dependability. He says, I can rely on Timothy. He commends him for his sincerity. He says his faith is genuine. He's proved himself. He commends him for his self-forgetfulness. He says that, everyone looks after their own interests, but Timothy he's selfless. And where did Timothy get this from? He got it from watching Paul. I really believe, guys, that what the church is really missing, and some years ago, I came to know this, that actually fulfilling the Great Commission is not just preaching the gospel. Fulfilling the Great Commission actually is making disciples. If we only preach the gospel, but we don't make disciples, we have not fulfilled the Great Commission. And the way that we're really going to make disciples is when we start to really, and I'm not talking just about the pastor here or the ministers, I'm talking about where all men and even the women take the time to begin to form these meaningful relationships where we're developing other people and bringing them through in the faith. I've closed by giving you an example of this. There's a lady in our church. She's 88. She's my mother. My mum died 8 years ago and I took her on as my mum. She's been wonderful. She's now terminal with cancer. So I'm actually watching her at the moment. Like, she's at home, but she's dying. But this lady, when she came in the church, when I first saw her, I thought, oh my gosh, she's in the wrong church. Because just the way she looked very like old school. I thought she was going to just get on our young people. But I was so wrong. This woman, she has taken all of the young ladies and she brings them to her house through the months, and she does like a 6-week thing. She teaches them to cook, she teaches them to sew, but she's doing all of this, but she's also talking to them and she gets into their life. And then they get into her life. They ask her questions and she's able to share with them and teach them. And I'm talking here now, maybe 30 young ladies, this 88-year-old woman. And today, as Saturday, she's dying of cancer and she's still got today young ladies coming to her house today to get this. Like, I just think they love to be around her, but she teaches them and she helps them. She mentors them, she counsels them, but she's using practical things to do this. I want to encourage us as I turn back to Brian. Can we consider being intentional about being fathers, and really raising up sons and daughters, people that really look at your faith, look at your way of life, your purpose, your love, your faith, your endurance, and I'll be inspired by the way you live, that we create disciples who are now going to make disciples. And I really believe that this is how our churches can grow and we can reach the next generation and see real church growth as young people come in, because I believe that they are hungry for these intentional relationships between fathers and sons.